Yesterday, while battling bouts of nausea and extreme headache and a lot of other things I'd prefer not to discuss, I got to watch the James Webb Space Telescope actually take flight. After 14 years of work, after almost $10 billion invested, this amazing instrument is finally on its way. And this, theoretically, could have capped a triumphant year for spaceflight. And in many ways, perhaps it was. But this was unquestionably a success, at least at present. Everything went flawlessly with the Ariane 5 in spite of misgivings with this particular rocket, and even though, as you can see, the rocket cams were less than ideal and we didn't get the greatest documentation of one of the most amazing and important events in spaceflight history, at least we know that it went off without a hitch. But we still have quite a few days in front of us and lots of things that could theoretically go wrong. But we're not going to talk about that right now. We can at least focus on what was successful. And obviously, it just wasn't JWST that succeeded in 2021, not by a long shot. I would say probably the most inspiring moment, at least in 2021, that I can think of when it comes to human spaceflight was this particular moment. And granted, I could be biased here because I saw this thing in person, but still, it was an inspiring moment indeed to see SN-15 take to the skies and then descend and stick the landing. And yes, I will finally say stick the landing because it did indeed do so. Even though it was on fire and even though it came perilously close to suffering the same fate as SN-10, it did not. This vessel did set down successfully and demonstrate that a completely reusable spacecraft is at least possible. Although, sadly, SN-15 will not be reused, and we're going to have to wait for a future iteration of this prototype to see it actually get reused and demonstrate that Starship is 100% possible. We do not yet have evidence to conclusively prove that. But unfortunately, aside from these two events, there are many others that just were not inspiring, were actually disappointing and damaging to the future of spaceflight, and this is why 2021 sucked. Roscosmos has always been a controversial organization with questionable practices, but last year they became a downright menace. The Noica module was the first significant problem when it docked with the International Space Station on July the 29th. Then it accidentally fired its thrusters. They couldn't figure out what the problem was. The ISS tried to compensate, could not do so, and NASA reported that there was a minor problem with the ISS, which was a significant understatement. The ISS actually spun 1.5 revolutions, about 540 degrees, before coming to a stop upside down. The space station then did a 180-degree forward flip to get back to its original orientation. Nothing like this has ever happened in the past. Shortly after this event, a Soyuz capsule, which was attached to the station, also had a misfiring of its thrusters and knocked the station off course. Not nearly as bad, but still having two malfunctions like this in just a few months is simply unacceptable and doesn't speak well for the future of Roscosmos and their competence. But none of these things could begin to compare with what Russia did intentionally just a few weeks ago, and all of us are very familiar with this, the test firing of a Russian anti-sat weapon which destroyed a sizable decommissioned Russian military satellite and released 1,500 trackable pieces of space garbage along with tens of thousands of untrackable objects, creating nothing less than an absolute nightmare in LEO, something that could very well cause serious problems in the future for many years to come, or perhaps even decades. Dangers to the ISS, dangers to all of these Starlink satellites and other satellite constellations that have either gone up or are planning to go up. This has created a situation that will haunt us for many years in the future of human spaceflight and also our ambitions in LEO. And Russia continues to not really explain why they did this, what the motivation was, aside from perhaps intimidation, to demonstrate to the world that they can do this, that without launching a single nuclear weapon, they could deal a death blow to the world's infrastructure, and as you can see right here, do a tremendous amount of damage to just about everything that's in LEO, including Starlink. As a matter of fact, we can only guess as to how much damage this is ultimately going to do to the Starlink constellation and everything else that's going to head into orbit afterwards. And what sucks even more about this is how little immediate action is being taken. My most recent video about British spaceflight and the very active role that the UK is taking in doing something about the space junk crisis is an example of what the entire world should be doing, but unfortunately only nations like the UK are actually doing it. And to be frank, even Britain is not investing enough. In my opinion, this is the biggest space story of 2021, the one that has the most long-term consequences, and the one that should be getting the most press coverage. Of course, just about everybody has forgotten about it, because frankly, people are stupid. Okay, maybe I'm being a little too blunt about that one, but I am very angry about this situation, and it's something that needs to be in the forefront of the news media every single day until we start doing something about this. Because if we don't take drastic action, the next thing that we're going to hear about is the Kessler syndrome and just how much our economy is being destroyed by it. But let's move on to some more incompetence. The Starliner, and yes, I've talked a hell of a lot about this, and 2021 was probably the worst year for the Starliner, because after nearly 2 years of work, the Starliner was brought back out to Cape Canaveral, prepared for launch, and suffered a problem that incapacitated the vast majority of its valves. To this day, we still have no idea what caused this. To this day, some of the valves are still stuck, and the only solution that Boeing has for this problem is to swap out the service module for a new one without clearly identifying the issue, and this is completely unacceptable. We have no idea, no guarantee as to whether or not the Starliner is going to be a safe and reliable method of taking our astronauts to the ISS and to other destinations in low Earth orbit. And we need a second alternative. We've always needed a second alternative, and the Starliner is never going to be that second alternative. And yet, NASA is pushing forward. Boeing is pushing forward, stubbornly staying the course, even though this project is clearly doomed. This too is something that absolutely sucks about 2021, and it's probably going to continue causing problems into 2022 and beyond. Fortunately, in 2021, NASA did put out a request for concept vehicles as far as a potential replacement for Starliner is concerned, but it's probably going to be years before any of that comes to fruition. We need another alternative to Crew Dragon, but unfortunately, we're not going to get it, and we're just going to have to deal with it. And speaking of Boeing, there are further problems coming up with this company, problems that I really hoped didn't exist and problems that I talked about very recently, and that is, of course, SLS. I was really hoping that given how many other companies are involved in this project, from Dynetics to ULA and others, that SLS would be an exception. After watching the Green Run take place successfully, I really started to think that this rocket would finally succeed, that it was finally going to take to the skies somewhere close to the estimated time frame. And I was honestly starting to become more and more optimistic by the day. The entire rocket was completely stacked, from the solid rocket boosters to the various stages to the Orion. Everything was put together and everything was looking very promising. And then things started to go to hell. The fourth quarter of 2021 turned into February of 2022, and then there was a problem with the controller on engine number 4, which pushed things to March or April of 2022. Now, this alone is not that awful if it turns out to be true. If Artemis 1 actually takes off in March or April of 2021, this will at least be halfway acceptable. But it's what we have coming down the line that also has me very much concerned. In 2021, further orders were placed for SLS. Lots of orders for quite a few rockets to carry SLS and the whole program through 2050. An extremely expensive and expendable rocket all the way through 2050, whereas in the meantime, the HLS program, which is absolutely vital, completely necessary actually, to put humans on the surface of the moon, received pathetic funding, about 15% of what was needed. Why the hell do we need so many SLS rockets when we don't have the means to set down on the surface of the moon? And because SLS, and indeed the entire Artemis project, was so woefully underfunded in 2021, it will be completely unsustainable as time goes on. Only one SLS rocket will fly to the moon every year. Only one planned landing on the moon every year, even with a reusable lander like Lunar Starship, simply because Lunar Starship requires so much on-orbit refueling to be reused. It's just not practical. There will only be a single landing on the moon every year, as opposed to the Apollo missions, which had several landings every year. And Apollo, as you may recall, failed. What chance does Artemis have with such infrequent visits to the moon and with a station that's going to be unoccupied most of the time? And speaking of HLS, Blue Origin did their very best to sabotage this program and Artemis in general by insisting that their lander, which is 2/3 non-reusable, was the best solution, and they held up the entire program for more than 6 months in court, arguing that their solution was the best. Even though the GAO insisted that they were not right, Jeff Bezos was not satisfied with this and continued to pursue the issue in court, even though Dynetics did not. Now, granted, Elon Musk has challenged issues with the GAO in the past, but even he didn't take things this far. It was a useless waste of time. It held up Artemis, it cost money, and put Artemis in danger in in general, as if this thing was going to be successful anyway. It was impractically huge as far as its ladder was concerned. It was mostly non-reusable, which means it would have guaranteed that only one landing be made on the surface of the moon anyway per year, simply because NASA would have had to have sent out a new descent element and a new transfer element every time they needed to land on the moon. Not an inexpensive prospect. And here's the worst part of all. Assuming that NASA eventually does get enough money for 2 landers, Blue Origin will ultimately be the second solution, simply because they are the second least expensive solution that's been proposed thus far. SpaceX and then Blue Origin and everybody else is substantially more expensive because they don't have billionaire founders. So what kind of solution is that going to be for Artemis? Lunar Starship is going to be a logistically difficult, although certainly possible solution, and the second one is most probably going to be something that is a bit more expensive and far, far less feasible. Artemis is in serious trouble, and mostly because of what's happened between 2020 and 2021. All we can hope is that Lunar Starship comes to fruition far more quickly than anything that Blue Origin puts out. But even if it does, the Artemis plan as it stands right now provides for only 30 days worth of activity on the Lunar Gateway per year, or that is to say 30 days between the Gateway and manned visits to the moon. And this will only increase to 60 days several years from now, not 6 months. Not 6 months anytime soon. And if we're going back to the moon to stay, then much, much longer duration stays need to be provided for. This is something that is well within our capabilities. The Falcon Heavy can certainly resupply astronauts on the Lunar Gateway for a very sustained period of time, and astronauts have proven time and again that they can sustain themselves in a microgravity environment for at least 6 months. So why these short duration stays? And while it is true that solar radiation and cosmic rays are going to be a lot more problematic in lunar orbit, this is something that we're going to have to learn how to contend with anyway if we ever want to go to Mars. And any lunar gateway design is going to have a substantial amount of radiation protection built into it. And this is not the extent of Blue Origin's problems. They suck as far as their engines are concerned as well. And if we do select Blue Origin as a second HLS provider, you can forget about them putting out any kind of effective engine anytime soon, at least if the BE-4 is any kind of indication. The BE-4 has been a disaster from the start. It's already a year and a half late from delivery, and this has put the Vulcan Centaur in a serious state of crisis, something I've discussed a number of times as well. And this is something that also became very apparent in 2021. The first static fires of Vulcan Centaur were supposed to be taking place at the end of 2020. The end of 2021 at the very latest. And guess what? The earliest flight of Vulcan Centaur at this point is now going to be taking place in September of 2022. Yet another terrible, inexcusable failure on the part of Blue Origin, and yet this company maintains its position as a centerpiece, a keystone of the American space program for reasons that I can't begin to imagine given how many failures they've had recently. But hell, if you look at Blue Origin's behavior as of late, you would think that these problems don't exist at all. As a matter of fact, you'd think that any problems don't exist at all, especially considering, as I mentioned before, that Jeff Bezos just pinned flight medals or astronaut wings or whatever the hell you want to call these things. They can't really be compared, let's admit it, to the kinds of flight wings that actual astronauts earn, but let's get past that for a moment and focus on the real issue. Jeff Bezos focused on this particular event and giving appreciation and recognition to these 6 people who either paid him a hell of a lot of money or gave him a lot of publicity, while ignoring the fact that 6 of his employees in Illinois were dead. He was giving no comfort whatsoever to those families, even though he certainly was aware of the fact that they had died by this time and didn't even acknowledge it for several hours after this particular ceremony where he gave all of this recognition to people that certainly would have understood. There's no question in my mind that these people would have accepted an underling or somebody else who works for Blue Origin giving him their astronaut wings, while Jeff Bezos flew out to Illinois to give comfort to the families of those employees. These are not bad people. They certainly would have acknowledged that. They certainly would have tolerated it, and they would have applauded Jeff Bezos for doing it. But instead, they had no idea what was actually happening here. And if I were one of them, I'd be extremely embarrassed right now and demanding that Jeff Bezos make a public apology. Not like he's gonna do that, of course. And of course, all this blunder did was add credence to the argument that the billionaires who are behind private spaceflight are just privileged, uncaring individuals who don't give a damn about you, me, the Earth, or anybody else aside from the billionaires who are wealthy enough to take advantage of their extremely expensive services. So why should anybody be behind private spaceflight? But believe it or not, there's somebody else who could make it even worse. And if you're a SpaceX fanboy, turn this video off right now.
I do think things are going to move very fast. So our plan is in basically 1 to 2 months to do the 20-kilometer or 65-foot flight with Starship Mark 1. Our next flight after that might actually just be all the way to orbit with a booster and the ship. I'm giving you just literally stream of consciousness here. Most likely we would not fly to orbit with Mark 1, but we would fly to orbit with Mark 3, which will be built after Mark 1 right here. In fact, we'll start building it in about a month.
This is, of course, what we all call Elon Time, and for a very long time now, we generally give Mr. Musk a pass on this sort of thing just because we assume that he might be a little bit off and maybe a little bit overly optimistic. But really, this causes more damage than a lot of us realize. If we're expecting something to go within a couple of months, and here we are a year and a half, 2 years later, with still no launch on the horizon, it starts becoming a bit demoralizing, a bit disenchanting, and also we begin to wonder just how much we can rely on SpaceX when it comes to time-crucial issues, such as going to the moon, such as completing Lunar Starship, because after all, once SLS and Orion are ready to go, then we also need a human landing system, and if Lunar Starship ends up being 2, 3, 4 years late, that's going to present a very serious problem, Now, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but nevertheless, it can be a bit problematic, and it can remove a lot of people's confidence in the space program. Now, it's very easy to blame all of this stuff on the FAA. However, if Elon was so confident that Starship was going to go to orbit in a few months after 2019, then why didn't he put in an application for an orbital launch way back then? Why did he wait until 2021 to put in the application? Did he seriously believe that Starship was going to be ready for an orbital shot that early? I have to admit, the guy isn't stupid, so I'm starting to think that he really didn't seriously believe this at the time and was just saying this in order to improve people's morale and to get people to work harder, which is fine as far as his company is concerned, but it's not fine if you're making commitments to NASA and the American people. And unfortunately, Elon Time is the least of Mr. Musk's problems right now. There are 6 sexual harassment suits going on at Tesla and 4 at SpaceX. And for those of you who think there's absolutely nothing valid about any of these things, I would remind you that in October, a $137 million settlement was made for a racial discrimination lawsuit at Tesla. So there has to be something to at least some of these lawsuits, although I firmly believe that people are innocent until proven guilty. So hopefully this one case was an isolated issue. That being the case, if Elon Musk is unaware of what's happening, if he is completely ignorant of this culture, assuming that it does exist at his company, then that's something he should make a statement about. He should say that if it does exist, he knew nothing about it, or if he did know something about it, he should own up. And if he did know something about it and has so far taken no action, he could be in very deep trouble. And the future of private spaceflight could be in very deep trouble, given how important Elon Musk is to all of this. I personally really hope that there's nothing serious to any of these allegations, but they are, in my opinion, one of the most serious things that have faced SpaceX thus far. We'll see what develops, and I'm going to stay on top of it, but as I said, it's my hope that nothing comes of it. So, lots of companies, lots of issues, lots of things that have unfortunately made 2021 one of the worst years for spaceflight and a year that has really pissed me off. Let's hope that 2022 is an improvement. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy my blunt and honest commentary about these sorts of things, no matter who my target might be, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. So until private spaceflight takes a turn for the better and we begin moving out into the solar system unfettered by all of this incompetence and corruption, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.